All right, we're into more familiar territory with the New Testament. Finally, all that Old Testament stuff and trying to figure it out, all the rest. So that's all behind us, right? Now we're into the good stuff, the new stuff, and the old is old and passed away. So let's get into it and see what we think here. The first reading for this week was from John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 20. So let's turn to that first. Chapter 1, the very beginning of John's Gospel. And chapter 1, verse 1 begins how? In the beginning. Remind you of anything? Maybe Genesis. I thought we were going to get out of the Old Testament. John makes a direct connection right from the start to the book of Genesis. Now, John's Gospel differs from the other three Gospels. They began by talking about Jesus. They introduced the main character of their books, of their writings, and they get right into naming Jesus, and this is the stuff about him. John doesn't. John goes back, and he starts the same place Genesis starts, which is in the beginning. And in John's Gospel, what was in the beginning? What's he say? The Word. Now, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, how did he do it? By speaking, right? By his Word. Now, the Word, John tells us, was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. So what we can say from this is that the Word was with God before there was a creation. Because nothing came into being, I think John says here, nothing came into being without him. So all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. So the Word was pre-existing creation. John takes us all the way back to the beginning in this understanding that this Word of God was with God, was God, is God, and it goes all the way back. Now, this is an important concept, I think, because Jesus is not identified directly here with the being the Word, but we know that that's who he's talking about. Jesus actually doesn't get mentioned by name until verse 17, so much later. But John's concept is God has been consistent from before creation, and that for people who may think that Jesus is a new creation of God that came at this point in time and did not exist before, I think when you read John's Gospel, you got a real problem with that. Because John is saying Jesus has always been. Because Jesus is God. We're not dealing with three gods, we're dealing with one God. And John is making his point. And so instead of coming at the birth of Jesus and a biography of Jesus and understanding kind of the historical setting of Jesus, it's more of a mystical kind of look of who is this person? Who is this Jesus? And where does he come from? And he ties it all the way back to Genesis 1. Now, I also think this is important for the simple reason that the New Testament doesn't start something totally new. The New Testament is a continuation of what has already happened in the Old. And so this Word has been consistent throughout creation and throughout the prophets and throughout the Old Testament. Now it is coming in this new way in the person of Jesus. So let me just stop there and say, what do you think? Any questions, comments on that? So we have a scriptural basis, John tells us, about Jesus going all the way back. And we're not dealing with them three gods. And Jesus was not just a person who was just a nice teacher. Jesus is God. In John's Gospel, there is absolutely no doubt that Jesus is God. And perhaps the clearest way in which that's shown is in the I am statements of Jesus. We remember the name of God in the Old Testament, that he called himself, revealed himself to Moses, was Yahweh. I am who I am. I am is the name of God. When Jesus says, I am, he is calling himself God. Jewish leaders would call that blasphemy. But Jesus is identifying himself as being God, the Son of God. In the Synoptic Gospels, especially Mark's Gospel, it's different. Because there, Jesus, in Mark's Gospel, he never calls himself the Son of God. He never says, I am. And so some have come up with what they call the Messianic Secret. At what time did Jesus really understand he was God? And so in Mark's Gospel, because he doesn't say it, therefore some would say maybe he didn't know he was really the Son of God. Mark's Gospel also, though, makes it clear that Jesus is the Son of God, not so much through his words, but through his actions. So when you look at Mark's Gospel, what does Jesus do? What are his actions? His actions are, he heals the sick, he raises the dead, he forgives sins, he calms the storms, he casts out demons. Well, who can do this? God. Who is Jesus? It must be God. Okay? So, all the Gospels make the point that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. But in John's Gospel, he just flat out says it. There is no hiddenness. It is overt. It is out there. And John is saying, this Son of God, this Jesus, has been present with God and is God from the very beginning, even pre-existing time of creation. All right, you already knew that? I mean, these are all, here's my challenge in this. These are familiar passages. I'm trying to come up with something that maybe you haven't completely thought about before or something like that. Because, I mean, there's no more familiar passages than the Christmas account and baptism and temptations and Gabriel and talking to Mary. This is familiar stuff. But I do think that's an important consideration for John's account. I also want you to go down to verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. How do we usually understand that? How do you understand those verses? Who didn't know him?
The world didn't know that Jesus was God.
That Jesus was God, yeah.
This in John usually thinks the Jewish people didn't recognize him.
Didn't recognize Jesus. So the hymn is always focused on the purpose or the person and ministry of Jesus. But so far Jesus hasn't been mentioned. Okay? What if this meant that since Jesus was there at the beginning, the Word was at the beginning, that the word that the prophet spoke was rejected by the people of Israel that the prophet spoke to? It's that the world that God began to speak to, and the people he called continue to reject God and turn away from him. So what we often do is we have Jesus so much in the forefront of our mind as we assume that these words are only about Jesus and what happens during his lifetime. He too was rejected, and the world didn't know it. And it certainly applies to Jesus, but couldn't it also apply to the prophets of the Old Testament and through the judges and all those who called for God's people to turn to him, and he in fact was the light and was the truth, and the people rejected him? I see a direct connection between people of God constantly turning their backs on God and not listening to God in the Old Testament with what Jesus is facing in the New. I don't see a difference. And I guess I'm trying to tie the Old Testament and the New Testament together so that we don't just close the book on the Old Testament and say we're starting over.